Hello, Euro Squad. Today we will see part 2 of our Cold War lecture series in which the Soviet Union and the United States are going to come into some hot conflict and then start to try and get a little bit more peaceful, a little peaceful coexistence. But then, will it erupt once again? Is World War III on the brink? We'll see today. So, first let's begin with Korea. Between 1945 and 1950, as we saw in our previous lesson, that the alliance between the World War II allies broke down. It has completely broken down. We can really see that especially with the development of the Truman Doctrine, with the Soviet Union spreading into Eastern Europe, creating buffer zones. The fall of Communist China will also be seen by the Soviet Union as an attempt to spread their influence around the world. And so Communist China, however, is going to be its own entity, as we saw at the end of that lesson, separating itself increasingly from the USSR and trying to lead the Third World. One indication of that early on is going to be at Korea, because in the Korean conflict, we'll see in 1950, in the post-war division of Korea along the 38th parallel, we've got North Korea led by Kim Il-sung, who wants to have a communist leadership in North Korea, and then therefore has an alliance with both China by 1950 and the USSR and Stalin. And then in South Korea, below the 38th parallel, we have Syngman Rhee, who wants to be in an alliance with the United States and maintain capitalism and democracy, so to speak, in South Korea. So that's the situation, but then Mao is going to convince Stalin that they should support this third world country in an invasion of South Korea. So North Korea getting diplomatic support from the Soviet Union and China, but also getting guns and money from both, with both of those armies being placed in reserve for a possibility of an attack, are going to support Kim Il-sung in his invasion of the South. And so this is going to take place in 1950 and take the Americans completely by surprise. So the Americans are going to call Douglas MacArthur away from Japan, bring him over with a peacekeeping force from the UN to start laying down the law. Now, it's a little controversial how this all happened, because this police action that's going to take place has to go before the United Nations. And remember that the Soviet Union has a veto in the agreement over whether or not to go into Korea. So the Soviet Union tried to protest the vote by not showing up to the vote, thinking that then the rest of the other 4 Permanent Security Council would not be able to pass the resolution. They didn't know the rule book, because once the Soviets were gone, it was even easier to pass the vote, and therefore they're going to create an American police action here, led by the Americans, but supported by other allied troops from the United Nations. So the invasion is going to take place, and initially they're supposed to just go up to the 38th parallel, but Douglas MacArthur is going to get a little aggressive and go all the way up to the river that connects Korea, or that separates Korea and China. So the Chinese are going to get pissed, and they're going to start sending in regiments. It looks like World War III is on the brink, and the United States even discussed the possibility of dropping atomic bombs on major Chinese cities, possibly even the Russians. So the Russians, meanwhile, they offered planes, tanks, all kinds of supplies to the North Koreans, and we know this because we could hear Russian being spoken over the radio waves as planes were flying with Korean symbols painted onto the wings, flying over and attacking American enforcements. And so when we shot down these planes, we noticed that the bodies that didn't completely burn up were also very Russian-looking. So it's quite apparent that the Cold War is starting to turn into not direct conflict between the United States and the USSR, but certainly indirect conflict in places, tough neighborhoods like Korea. By the way, the Korean War did not end with an actual peace treaty. Instead, it ended with a ceasefire. So the Korean War is technically still going. So today, when there's issues in Korea, it's technically not over. War could happen again, so it ends in stalemate, the so-called forgotten war. All right, meanwhile, back in the Soviet Union, Stalin's going to croak. He's going to die, and so his number gets called in 1953. Once Stalin croaks, I mean, people are sad. Imagine that, people being sad that this terrible dictator has died. Well, they are. I mean, there's a lot of people crushed by this thing. One guy who pretended to be crushed at the funeral, but then later is going to come and speak out against him was Nikita Khrushchev. Stay tuned for him. But it's obvious in Russia after the death of Stalin that reforms are definitely necessary. There's a lot of fear of Stalin's political terrorism. There's fear that the collective leadership that's coming in, there's supposed to be a three-man committee, basically, an oligarchy that's supposed to rule the state now. Well, there's a fear that they're going to start killing each other off and start committing more acts of political terror, similar to what Stalin did against Trotsky and other old guard Bolshevik leaders in the 1920s and 30s. Thankfully, that's not really going to happen too much anyway. All right. There's also problems in the economy. There's this debate about there's this issue, of what we call guns and butter. Essentially, a good country in the Cold War, a successful country in the Cold War, needs to be able to produce both guns and butter. Guns to protect their army, guns as a defense force, possibly as an aggressive force in wars as well around the globe, but also be able to provide its basic necessities for its people. And so far, Stalin is not able to do that. He makes the guns, but not the butter. And so Stalin's foreign policy has also completely isolated the USSR. His brinkmanship, his buffer zones, satellite states, and rigged elections in Eastern Europe, not working to make the USSR a favorable country in the eyes of the world, particularly in the eyes of Western capitalist leaders. All right, and so that brings in Nikita Khrushchev, who was working hand in hand with Stalin on many of these things, but as soon as Stalin's dead, he's going to change his tune and come up with a little thing called the Khrushchev thaw.
Inside the Soviet Union, Khrushchev wanted to overcome the legacy of Stalinist terror and hardship. He put more resources into the production of consumer goods and housing. Thousands of political prisoners had been freed from the Gulag.
My father was a strong believer in the communism. For him it was the best life to the people. It is like the heaven of the earth. And he many times repeat that it is impossible to live in the heaven surrounded by the barbed wires.
Khrushchev used the 20th Soviet Party Congress to end the hero worship of Stalin and expose the cruelties of his dictatorship. During a secret session, Khrushchev made a speech that astounded everyone present.
When he made his speech, people in the hall started to groan. There were shouts of shame.
Stalin, Khrushchev told his audience, had ordered the imprisonment and execution of thousands of loyal communists, workers, managers, and soldiers. No one, peasant or general, had been safe from Stalin's terror.
Khrushchev himself wasn't without guilt. He had played an active part in Stalin's repressions in Ukraine and in other parts of the country. He had no moral right to speak about Stalin as if he himself was pure.
He did not say anything new for me, or for the majority of my friends. He did not say everything that needed to be said, but we were happy that at least it was said. He said it in a half-whisper, literally in secret. It was not printed in the newspapers, but came out in a leaflet read at party meetings, and sometimes outside. We used to say, "This is the beginning of truth. Truth will win."
This fear, this tormenting fear after Stalin's death began to fade away. After the 20th Congress, it looked as if this fear would never return.
Khrushchev's secret speech was perfect propaganda for the American-financed Radio Free Europe. The text of Khrushchev's speech was broadcast after the CIA received a copy from the Israeli intelligence service.
They were just repeating for 24 hours, 1 hour speech, over and over and over again. And this was to the party people who were brainwashed, were led to believe, and they did believe, that Stalin is God, that couldn't make any mistake. Everything he did was infallible. Suddenly, their faith, their religion collapsed.
So as you heard from the video there, Nikita Khrushchev, the new leader by 1955, he's going to replace the oligarchical collectivism that was supposed to rule the USSR in Stalin's demise, and he's going to become the single-party dictator once again. But he believed in communism. As you heard from his son, Nikita Khrushchev believed in communism, believed it was heaven on earth, but heaven is not heaven when it's surrounded by barbed wire. So Nikita Khrushchev is going to go before a super secret meeting of the 20th Party Congress. Now, it's really not that big of a secret because the 20th Party Congress is all the representatives from around the USSR that are coming to this thing to listen to the speaker. And there's a lot of different speeches that are going to be made about a lot of different topics, but in this case, the most controversial one is going to be Khrushchev himself saying that the Stalinist terror was a bad thing for Russia. And he is a part of the reform movement that wants to see a thaw in these relations with the West, so that rather than being so icy, so ice-cold with the United States, we'll find a way to have what he called peaceful coexistence. He also wants to see greater freedoms within Russia, wants to see some changes happening. It's a little thing called liberalization, also called De-Stalinization, where his foreign policy is going to be dramatically different. His foreign policy will emphasize peaceful coexistence, and we can see that with things like the kitchen debate, as it was called. You see here in these pictures we have Mr. Richard Milhous Nixon, who was one of the leaders of the anti-communist movement during the Second Red Scare in the United States. I mean, before he became the vice presidential running mate with Eisenhower, he was a red baiter. I mean, he did not like commies. He was a part of HUAC as well, the House of Un-American Activities Committee. And so he's going to be invited by Khrushchev to come to the World's Fair that was taking place in Moscow, where they're going to meet and they're going to talk on television, on camera. The commies have television now. Look at that. They're making some room here for cool new stuff. They're going to be talking in design-modeled kitchens where Khrushchev is going to say, look, America, you know, you've had 200 years of development in your history. You've had your issues. Civil War, slavery, you know, women's lack of equality, you know, voting rights issues. Yeah. So he's going to say, look, you've had all of those problems. And we have been around for roughly 50 years. And we're having those same issues. But we're doing it faster. We are catching up to the United States. And he's right. Because by 1955, under Nikita Khrushchev, the USSR will be the strongest, most powerful economy in the world, and it's a communist, single-party dictatorship economy. So that's interesting. Another thing he's going to do, though, is allow greater intellectual freedom. He's going to allow greater free speech. Now, that doesn't mean total free speech, but hey, it's more than before. Fewer bullets going in the back of anybody's heads here for saying that they may not like some of the government policies, for instance. The gulags are not going to be as overwhelmingly full anymore either, so that's nice. And then in terms of Eastern Europe, Khrushchev said that he wanted to have an iron fist with a velvet glove, meaning, you know, if they get uppity, he might bring the smack down, but he's going to be nice about it, as nice as he possibly can be about it. All right, so the test will come quite early. So now that greater liberalization is being allowed, it's going to stimulate rebellion in Eastern Europe almost immediately. For instance, in Poland, only within just a year or two of the 20th Party Congress, they're going to start asking for greater voting rights. They want to start holding elections in order to nominate their own representatives rather than having appointed communist representatives. Now they're going to, you know, not push the envelope too far. They're going to say we want to elect communists. We want to have greater say in who runs our government, but we'll make sure that there's still socialists and communists. But, I mean, the test is on. The world is watching to see what will Khrushchev do. Will he bring the smack down and crush this rebellion? Or will he allow them to talk smack about the USSR? And at least for now, in Poland, he's going to allow them to talk a little smack, do a little electing, get some different people in there, but they still got to maintain communists. So there's the velvet glove for you. The iron fist is going to come in Hungary. Hungary was hungry for change. Yeah. They were hungry for goulash socialism, which is a mixture of socialism and capitalism. That was pushing the envelope a little too far for Khrushchev. He didn't like seeing all those beautiful statues of Stalin and Lenin coming down, toppling to the ground around as people were graffitiing them and spitting upon them. And so now he's saying, you're starting to push it, guys. He's waiting to see what will the West do if I intervene. Well, the West, unfortunately at the time, United States, Great Britain, France, they were involved in scandals and problems involving the Suez Canal. There was the Suez Crisis, as it was called, in 1956. Their hands were tied. So Khrushchev said, well, time to roll in the tanks, baby. He brings in the tanks and says that democratic revolution ain't going to happen. We're going to reestablish the right kind of communism, which is this satellite state, which has to be leaning on the Soviet Union. Not goulash socialism, which borders upon breaking away from the Soviet Union. Stay tuned for 1989 and the rapid fall of communism in Eastern Europe based upon those same principles. All right. Meanwhile, over in Berlin, things are getting crazy once again. Things are getting difficult because essentially Khrushchev is watching as his best people are leaving from East Berlin. I mean, West Berlin is like this nice little golden nugget of capitalism sitting in the wasteland of East European communism. Obviously that's biased by a guy that's sitting here with a MacBook and, loves capitalism, whatever. But still, the point being that Khrushchev does not want to see this Western capitalist influence hanging out in his country. So he's going to try and prevent it from being seen and, escaping, from having his people escape to capitalism. So what he wants to do is keep the East Germans in the East. He wants to keep the East Berliners in the East and not fleeing to their jobs and their fun stuff hanging out over in the West. And so what he will do is first put up guards, then put up a fence, then put up a wall, the stone and concrete barrier that will be the best representation of how Berlin is the microcosm of everything in the Cold War. All right, and so the reason he's doing it is because approximately 30,000 people per month that are educated, young, and skilled are leaving over to the West to seek greater opportunities and to seek things like, Coca-Cola and Hershey bars and freedom. So he doesn't like that. And so Khrushchev is going to start building this wall. And as he's doing it, in the United Nations, people are going to criticize him. Particularly the United States representatives are going to criticize him. So in a beautifully, I think, funny moment, Khrushchev is going to take off his shoe, and he's going to tell the United States, you think you're so great? You think you're doing so many good things? Tell me about slavery. Tell me about the situation facing African Americans still today in your country. You think you're so wonderful what you've done in your 200 years? Look what we've done in 50. And eventually we will surpass you, and America, we will bury you. And as he's saying that, he's slamming his shoe on the podium. Isn't that fun? Leave it to the Russians to give us something exciting to talk about in the press. Well, Kennedy, the now president of the United States, is going to have a very different response. So compare the "we will bury you" speech to this one.
There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. There are some who say that communism is the wave of the future. Let them come to Berlin. A few who say that it's true that communism is an evil system, but it permits us to make economic progress. Lass sie nach Berlin kommen. Let them come. Free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
applauded the president for the last time, for within a few months, the square would be still and silent and would be renamed in his memory.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you, Kennedy, for that stirring speech in Berlin in 1963. Again, very different comparison here between what we saw with "We Will Bury You" from Khrushchev and now with Kennedy speaking to the people of Berlin about freedom. Very powerful images as well, juxtaposed with the speech being made by Kennedy. Let them come to Berlin. Oh, beautiful. In it, though, he also gave another beautiful quote. He said, 2,000 years ago, the proudest boast was civis Romanus sum, which means I am a Roman citizen. Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is Ich bin ein Berliner. All free men, wherever they may be, are citizens of Berlin, and therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words Ich bin ein Berliner. Now, people since then have had a good time criticizing my boy Kennedy for saying Ich bin ein Berliner, because if he had said Ich bin Berliner, that would be more grammatically accurate to say I am a person of Berlin. I am a Berlin citizen. However, since he said Ich bin ein Berliner, essentially he called himself a jelly donut. Now, that's, kind of being a grammatical pettifogger here, but really, I mean, the American press, they were the only ones that had a good time being like, he called himself a jelly donut, look at that. But really, Berliners, man, they could have cared less. Plus, they said, well, you're not actually from Berlin, so technically it's grammatically correct, but it's still kind of funny. So thank you, Kennedy, for inspiring the masses. The end of reform we're going to see coming very quickly, though, because, I mean, we've got the situation in Berlin as a problem, but certainly the thing that's going to really end this reform movement will be the Cuban Missile Crisis. So 1959, Fidel Castro is going to overthrow Leon Batista of the Cuban government, and Cuba up to that point had been basically a hot spot for American tourists and industry and business that was investing in Cuba as a vacationer location and product, kind of like exporting our products to Cuba as kind of like a little imperialist style deal. Well, Fidel Castro and the communists didn't like it, and so initially a popular movement, they're going to overthrow the dictator Leon Batista and establish a relationship with Nikita Khrushchev over in Russia. Now, the United States is nervous about this at this time because that means that we have got a communist state, a communist dictatorship just 90 miles off our coast of southern Florida. Plus, Guantanamo Bay, by the way, is still a United States base at this time, and we want to make sure that we maintain that base. All right, and so what we're going to do is actually Kennedy is going to invade the Bay of Pigs invasion from the Eisenhower administration, which was set up by the CIA to try and train Cuban guerrilla fighters from Cuba who had left during the revolution and fled to places like Guatemala. So in Guatemala and even off the coast of Florida, we're going to train these men in military exercises and then have them invade at the Bay of Pigs. It's going to be, according to the CIA, a perfect failure because Castro's forces will see it coming and they will so effectively block the invasion. This is an embarrassing moment for the Kennedy administration, showing that we are weak. And because of this, the communists will also think we're weak. Nikita Khrushchev says, well, look at that, Kennedy didn't go so well. What he's thinking is he wants to start to put some ICBMs over in Castro's Cuba, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so he wants to put these things there because, I'd be worried too. Kennedy had been putting intercontinental ballistic missiles, which could easily destroy the USSR in places like Germany and Turkey. So as the result, Khrushchev thinks it's only fair to put some in our backyard, and so we can get some U-2 aerial footage here that shows us that ICBMs and various launch pads are being constructed and prepared for the arrival of those nuclear bombs. Now, this truly is a fearful moment because, as you can see from the map here, the different types of missiles that are headed over to the southern coast of the United States here in Cuba, they have the potential, with the various types that we have, to destroy all of the United States. I mean, we are well within their target range to destroy everything up to basically the border of Idaho and Northern California. So, I mean, there's a good threat here, potential threat. So Kennedy is going to call for a naval blockade. For 13 days, the world will wait on the edge of their seat. Here's a video.
In 1962, the Cold War was heating up in America's backyard. Since aligning himself with the Soviet Union, Cuban dictator Fidel Castro was an object of growing U.S. concern. A failed attempt to oust him from power in April 1961 through the use of Cuban exile forces emboldened both Castro and his Kremlin supporters. In May 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev offered to install offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba. Castro readily agreed, viewing the missiles as a deterrent against another U.S. attempt to force him from power. Missiles began to arrive that summer under the tightest secrecy. Khrushchev's plan depended on getting the missiles operational before the Americans discovered they were there. But U.S. intelligence quickly learned that something unusual was afoot on the island nation. In early October, U-2 and Navy reconnaissance flights provided alarming but conclusive evidence that the Soviets were constructing missile launch sites throughout Cuba. President Kennedy immediately assembled his national security team, including military members of the Joint Staff, to determine a course of action. After several days in which all the options were weighed, the administration announced a strict naval quarantine of Cuba, in which U.S. Navy ships would prevent any further offensive military weapons from being delivered to Cuba.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
While this policy was deemed less risky than a full-scale strike against Cuba, it was not without risk. A blockade was, after all, an act of war. But by calling it a quarantine and limiting it to offensive military weapons, the U.S. gained support from key Allied governments. "It looks like it's up to the Navy," Kennedy said to Chief of Naval Operations Admiral George W. Anderson. "Mr. President, the Navy will not let you down," Anderson replied. Indeed, the burden fell squarely on the U.S. Navy. Naval forces under U.S. Atlantic Command, headed by Admiral Robert L. Dennison, steamed out to sea, intercepting not only merchant shipping en route to Cuba, but Soviet submarines operating in the area as well. One of the first destroyers on the scene, USS Blandy, diligently tracked a Soviet Foxtrot submarine, eventually forcing it to surface. We now know these submarines were carrying nuclear-tipped torpedoes and were the spearhead of a Soviet effort to establish a naval base on Cuba. U.S. destroyers maintained the quarantine. Radar picket ships, supported by Navy fighters and airborne early warning planes, assisted the U.S. Air Force's Air Defense Command in preparing to defend American airspace from Soviet and Cuban forces. The aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and Marine forces of the Second Fleet under Vice Admiral Alfred G. Ward were poised to launch air, naval gunfire, and amphibious strikes against Soviet and Cuban forces ashore if the quarantine failed. For 13 days in late October, the world held its breath.
This is Radio Moscow. Premier Khrushchev has sent a message to President Kennedy today. The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
The Soviet ships turned back. The crisis was over. Khrushchev, faced with the armed might of the United States and its allies, had little choice but to find some way out of the difficult situation in which he had placed himself and his country. President Kennedy did not press the advantage that the strength of U.S. and Allied naval and military forces gave him. That allowed the Soviet leader to peacefully disengage his nation from this most serious of confrontations. For the rest of the Cold War, the U.S. and Soviet Union never again reached the brink of what would have been a world-altering nuclear conflict. The lesson is clear.
Oh, brilliant maneuver by my boy Kennedy. Absolutely brilliant maneuver here to avoid war. Now, the Cuban Missile Crisis, though, will have some dramatic effects. I mean, first of all, the world saw just how close we can come to destroying ourselves with this thing. Secondly, the United States government realized we need to have a hotline between us and the USSR real fast so that we can establish contact and avoid a potential misfire or some kind of disagreement that could bubble into war because we weren't communicating quite well enough when neither of us wants war. So they established the hotline, which is a direct telephone line between Washington, D.C. and Moscow because of this. Also, we see that Kennedy and Khrushchev are going to meet after this in Europe to discuss the nuclear test ban treaty, which was one of Kennedy's brainchild kind of ideas. What he said is that we need to start limiting not necessarily our numbers of nuclear armaments, because a lot of people were not a fan of limiting nuclear arms per se, but he said we need to stop testing them so frequently, and we need to stop testing them above ground. So this made it essentially illegal for governments to test their nuclear weapons above ground. So Kennedy's efforts here, along with Khrushchev, is to find some kind of agreement where they can at least start to end this arms race, which has plagued both the United States and the USSR up to this point in the Cold War. Brilliant! Thank you, Kennedy and Khrushchev, for finding some nice medium ground here. All right, now, it's not going to work well here for Nikita Khrushchev because, as you heard in the video there, the United States did not press the issue, which would have made Khrushchev look like a buffoon. Khrushchev also got the United States to agree that they would remove some of their nuclear arsenal from Turkey and not put so many in West Germany, but that had to be a secret agreement. And so Khrushchev still is going to lose face here. So by 1964, he's not going to have many friends within the Communist Party who believed that he was too weak in the face of the American imperialists and Kennedy. So because of the controversy and the near war and the lack of adequate leadership seen in the Cuban Missile Crisis, Leonid Brezhnev is going to find a way to get other conservatives on board and take over the communist government and wrest control away from Khrushchev, who will then have to go into exile. So they believe that de-Stalinization and liberalization is too liberal, that it's going to bring the Soviet Union down. It's going to ruin their beautiful heaven on earth. And so he wanted to re-Stalinize and focus on Stalin's good points, like his mustache and the gulags. Can't think of much else. And, we should get rid of the gulags from that list too. So his mustache, we should focus on that, and his statues. Those were neat. So the conservative response here is essentially, hey, let's turn back the clock and do a massive arms build-up. Let's get booked up on some guns. Meanwhile, Brezhnev is also hoping that he can find a way to solidify relations better with Eastern Europe and not let them go so liberal and far away from what Brezhnev's hoping to achieve. And so we see here a very famous picture of Leonid Brezhnev giving the fraternal kiss of communism to Mr. Erich Honecker of East Germany, the leader of East Germany. So this fraternal kiss, it was something that the socialists did. Just another reason that America is superior, I guess. The fraternal kiss is a sign of unity between these nations and agreement. It's a ritual, right? And so it was not supposed to be photographed, and yet it was. And so the photograph became widespread anti-Soviet anti-Soviet propaganda, including even a mural painted on the western side of the Berlin Wall. And it says in this thing, the graffiti painting says, "My God, help me to survive this deadly love." Oh, it's kind of funny. That sounds like a good rock and roll song or something, right? Okay, so Leonid Brezhnev, he's facing some issues, as you can see. Now, one of which is the Czech Revolt. In 1968, Alexander Dubček is a communist leader who wants to kind of downplay the communism a little bit and do what he calls socialism with a human face. Socialism with a human face means that we're going to treat people a little nicer, allow for some free elections, allow for some liberalization, and take it even farther than Khrushchev did. But Brezhnev didn't like it. In come the Soviet tanks, giving us some super cool pictures. Gosh, I wish I could be that dude flashing my chest to a tank someday. That's going to be me in history someday. Watch out for me, YouTubers. You might see me someday on the news doing that. But anyway, Brezhnev doesn't like this revolt, and so he'll roll in the tanks and give us a new doctrine of the Cold War. We had the Truman Doctrine back in 1947 saying that the Americans would intervene militarily and economically anywhere that Soviet communism threatens capitalist democracy. In the Brezhnev Doctrine, he's saying that the Soviets will intervene anywhere it sees the need to preserve their status quo of communist states. All right. Meanwhile, across the globe, we have a little thing called decolonization. So basically, the era of new imperialism, by 1945, countries are realizing they can't afford it anymore. Great Britain's really the first to recognize that. France will be forced to recognize it very soon. But countries can't afford their imperialist conquests of the 19th century. We also, from decolonization, get these ideas of the developed world or the first world versus developing countries. So we get these ideas of first world, which is industrialized Western capitalist states, second world, which is the communist states, socialist states, and then third world, which is everybody else who, doesn't have toilet paper or indoor plumbing or electricity or running water, right? So those are developing countries. No matter how you look at the situation in much of the colonized world, it's often developing and often leading to political instability as well because of the lack of economic development. When these powers, like for instance, when Great Britain pulls out of the Sudan, they're just going to leave it behind essentially and leave those groups that they once ruled over to fight it out amongst themselves, resulting in things like the Darfur massacre today, which we still deal with because of the lack of stability caused by the lack of political government that leaves in a hurry. And then the Cold War is also going to connect this between economics and politics because both the United States and the Soviet Union are competing for votes within the UN. Both want new friends and partners in the UN, and so they will actively compete with their guns, their money, their influence to get allies across the globe in these states that are now no longer under the influence of European countries. So first we see this in Palestine. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 was a British document essentially stating that Zionists and the Jews of Europe deserve to have their own country in Palestine, created as a country of Israel, even if that means coming at the stake of Palestinians in their land. And so the UN Resolution 242 will establish the state of Israel, which leads to all kinds of conflict because Israel, of course, will displace many Palestinians. They will be backed by an alliance with much of the West, including the United States, and we will help fund their military. And so today, for instance, the Israelis are the only country in the Middle East that have an arsenal of nuclear weapons. So that makes their neighbors nervous. And throughout the 20th and 21st century, there have been wars fought where Israel goes on the aggressive because their neighbors are ticking them off. Both sides have arguments there, but we don't have time for it here. Now, meanwhile, in India, the British government is basically going to be forced out of India because they're going to encounter Gandhi, Mohandas K. Gandhi, and the Satyagraha movement, which was his nonviolent resistance movement. So as British forces are charging in to try and take out these groups of Indian resistance leaders that are wanting to see the British government leave India and allow for self-rule, as they're charging in, Gandhi won't fight back. He and his followers will simply lay down and allow the Brits to attack them. And so they'll spend time in jail. They'll starve themselves. You name it. They want the Brits out. A sign of how indigenous populations can use nationalism to force Europeans out of their countries. At times they'll be forced out through warfare, as we'll see in Vietnam. So the French dominated much of Indochina, like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, but they will be forced out of Vietnam first and then eventually out of the rest because they can't afford it, number one, and number two, Ho Chi Minh and the communists are going to fight against them with much support from the Chinese and to some extent certainly the Russians as well, getting guns and money. And so at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the French can no longer hold on to this territory, and so they will be forced out. Now this leads into a whole case study of decolonization that we don't have time for here, but the idea of the falling dominoes and the United States influence and the United States desire not to see Vietnam go communist. All right. Then we've got over in Algeria in 1962, the Algerians will revolt in order to try and topple the French Fourth Republic and their influence in Algeria. And it'll work because there's going to be so many men sent to try and put down this movement that it's just costing too much money. It's bankrupting the government. Men are coming home in body bags. The French don't want to see it anymore. So the Fourth Republic will be toppled and in will come the French Fifth Republic with President Charles de Gaulle as their leader. Meanwhile, in South Africa, all the way until the late 80s, we're going to have apartheid in British South Africa, which is essentially the idea that natives are not capable of running their own country, and therefore the imperialist overlords, the Europeans, should be the ones to do it. So apartheid was similar to Jim Crow in the United States, was ugly, was dirty, and will lead to all kinds of problems that will require resistance and nonviolent fighting, essentially, to bring the British out of South Africa. Africa. So that's a quick and dirty version of decolonization. For more on that, check out the links on the webpage for the crash course version of decolonization. Thanks for watching.